March the 2nd, 1968, outskirts of Quảng Province, Vietnam. Private Bill Harshman pushed through knee-high elephant grass, sweat soaking through his uniform. Eyes searching the trail ahead. The air was thick, crushed with humidity, but eerily silent. No jungle birds. Just the faint rattle of gear. Distant thunder, rolling somewhere. Harshman moved past a half-submerged log, nudging it aside with the toe of his boot. That's when he caught it. A single strand of brown wire, so tight it almost disappeared against the mud. The line ran taut into the brush. Wrong color for a root, wrong angle for a vine. He froze. Behind him, the column stacked up, waiting, nobody daring to move. Harshman's muscles tensed as adrenaline kicked in, turning minutes into seconds. His mind raced through possibilities. Punji stakes, tripwire grenades, the hard snap of bamboo swinging down from above. The sergeant stepped up quietly, signaling for everyone to hold position. The brush ahead looked empty, but no one breathed easy. In Vietnam, the jungle itself had turned against them. For the next 3 hours, the squad crawled forward yard by yard, knowing any step could be their last. The real enemy here wasn't a uniform, or even a human face. It was the ground beneath their feet. What looked like a routine jungle patrol had become a war against the unseen, one where survival depended on outsmarting traps, not just outshooting an enemy. The men soon learned that in Vietnam, survival meant fearing not just the enemy ahead, but every inch of earth underfoot. Because here, the jungle itself fought back. The first American soldier fell into a punji pit November 12, 1965. Outside the village of Bin Gia, Private First Class Michael Torres was on point, leading his squad through dense undergrowth. The ground collapsed beneath him. The scream that followed made veterans of 2 wars freeze where they stood. Torres had dropped 4 feet onto a bed of sharpened bamboo stakes, each one 18 inches long, driven through his lower legs and thighs at angles designed to prevent extraction. The medic who reached him found the stakes weren't just sharp. They were coated with something brown, something that smelled of rot. Within 48 hours, Torres developed sepsis. Within a week, he'd lost his left leg below the knee. The infection that kept surgeons from taking the right leg left permanent nerve damage. He was 20 years old. The Viet Cong had perfected these weapons over generations of warfare. Bamboo grew everywhere in Vietnam, cost nothing, required no factories to produce. A single fighter could make 20 Panji stakes in an hour, nothing but a knife and local materials. The stakes were fire-hardened to needle points, then deliberately contaminated, smeared with feces, urine, decomposing animal matter. Guaranteed infection even from shallow wounds. American mine detectors, calibrated for metal, registered nothing. The traps exploited human reflexes with surgical precision. Soldiers stepping into pits would instinctively try to pull their legs free, driving the downward angled stakes deeper into muscle and bone. Some pits were dug in pairs, so when a wounded man's squad mates rushed to help, they'd fall into adjacent traps. Others featured cross beams studded with spikes at chest height, impaling victims as they fell. Intelligence reports documented cartridge traps, single rifle rounds placed over firing pins in bamboo tubes, camouflaged in dirt, waiting for the pressure of a boot to fire upward through a soldier's foot. Toe poppers, the men called them, though the nickname hid their true lethality. Larger shells, 105mm howitzer rounds, could take a leg or kill outright. By January 1966, American units started developing countermeasures. Point men learned to watch for disturbed earth, unnatural patterns in ground cover, subtle differences in vegetation color that might mean recent digging. Some squads brought combat engineers forward to probe suspected areas, bayonets or thin steel rods. The techniques worked occasionally. A platoon from the 1st Infantry Division spotted 17 concealed pits during a single patrol near Cu Chi, marking each one with white phosphorus grenades before destroying them with explosives. For 3 miles, they moved without casualty, proving that training and vigilance could defeat these primitive weapons. But the price of that vigilance was measured in time and mental exhaustion. Patrols that should have covered 6 kilometers per hour now moved at 1. Every step required visual inspection of the ground ahead. Every fallen log, every patch of disturbed leaves, every depression in the trail demanded investigation. Soldiers developed a distinctive gait, short, careful steps, weight distributed gradually, eyes fixed downward rather than scanning for enemy fighters. The psychological toll mounted faster than the physical casualties. Men who survived Punji pits developed permanent hypervigilance, unable to trust any ground surface, their nervous systems rewired by trauma into permanent alert states, states that would last decades after the war ended. By March 1966, Viet Cong engineers had adapted their tactics. If American forces learned to spot traps in the jungle, the VC would place them in abandoned villages instead. Rigged beneath doorways, hidden inside collapsed hooches, buried in paths between buildings where soldiers might seek shelter from monsoon rains. A Marine rifle company entered the deserted hamlet of Pu Loc, 20 kilometers south of Da Nang. The village had been emptied days earlier. Whether evacuated by ARVN forces or abandoned by fleeing civilians, intelligence couldn't confirm. Rain had just stopped, leaving the thatched roofs dripping and paths turned to mud. Staff Sergeant David Chen moved his squad forward cautiously, weapons raised, checking windows and doorways for movement. The first hooch stood silent, its bamboo door hanging at an angle. Lance Corporal James Riley stepped toward it, reaching for the frame. Chen grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back. Something about the door bothered him, the way it hung, slightly too perfect, the hinges positioned wrong. He knelt, examining the threshold. A fishing line, nearly invisible, stretched from the door across the entrance at ankle height. Following it with his eyes, he traced the line to a grenade wedged into the wall framework. Pin already loosened, held in place by the door's position. Opening it would pull the pin free. The blast radius would kill anyone standing in the doorway, wound everyone within 5 meters. The Viet Cong had developed an entire dictionary of structural traps by early 1966. The simplest involved doors and windows rigged with grenades. Either American M26s captured during overrun positions or Chinese Type 67s smuggled south. More sophisticated versions used pressure plates concealed beneath floor mats or doorway thresholds. Bamboo traps, spike boards counterweighted and suspended above doorways, would swing down when triggered, driving foot-long bamboo spears into faces and chests. Some structures contained layered defenses, a visible tripwire that soldiers would carefully step over, only to trigger a hidden pressure plate inside. Intelligence reports documented cases where entire buildings had been rigged to collapse, support beams partially sawed through and held in place by tripwires. Opening a door or moving furniture could bring the roof down on everyone inside. By mid-1966, Marine and Army combat engineers had developed systematic clearing procedures. Teams would approach structures from angles that minimized exposure, using grappling hooks to pull doors open from a distance, mirrors on poles to check interiors, metal detectors to sweep for buried explosives. Engineer Sergeant Michael Kovacs from the 1st Engineer Battalion developed a protocol that saved dozens of lives. Mark the structure, clear a perimeter, probe all approaches, trigger any visible traps remotely, then, and only then, enter with extreme caution. His unit cleared 43 booby-trap structures in Quảng Nam province over 3 months, without losing a man. But the procedures couldn't eliminate the fear. Soldiers who'd survived booby-trap buildings developed an instinctive aversion to enclosed spaces. They'd sleep in the open during monsoons rather than risk abandoned shelters. They'd refuse billets in villages, preferring to dig fighting positions in mud. The psychological calculus was brutal but rational. Being wet and miserable was preferable to being vaporized by a grenade you never saw. Letters home described the constant tension, the way every doorway became a potential death trap, how the simple human desire for shelter had been weaponized against them. July 3, 1966. A platoon from the 25th Infantry Division occupied an apparently cleared village near Tai Ninh. 12 men sheltered in a large hooch during an evening rainstorm. At 21:30 hours, a private leaned against a support beam. The building exploded, killing 9 instantly and wounding the other 3. Investigation revealed a secondary trap, missed during clearing. a pressure-sensitive mine rigged to a disguised beam inside the structure. After that incident, entire companies refused to enter buildings, regardless of orders. Specialist Robert Harris moved carefully along a narrow jungle trail, 3 kilometers west of Chu Lai, his eyes scanning the path ahead for signs of disturbance. He was walking point, the most dangerous position in any patrol, the first man to encounter whatever waited ahead. The trail curved around a massive teak tree, forcing the column into single file. Harris noticed something that made his chest tighten. 2 small bamboo stakes on either side of the path, positioned too symmetrically to be natural. He raised his fist, halting the patrol behind him. Kneeling, Wilandorinam. He examined the area at knee height. There, stretched between the stakes, was a thin wire, fishing line actually, nearly invisible in the dappled jungle light. Following it with his eyes, he spotted 2 tin cans wedged into crevices on opposite sides of the trail. Inside each can, barely visible, the distinctive shape of an M26 grenade. The pins had already been pulled, the safety levers held down only by the pressure of the can walls. One step into that wire would jerk both grenades free. The kill radius would hit anyone within 5 meters. The tripwire grenade was the Viet Cong's most common booby trap by 1966. The mechanics were brutally simple. Attach a wire to a grenade, pull the pin, insert the grenade into a container that holds the safety lever down. String the wire across a likely path, and wait. When a soldier's leg caught the wire, it would pull the grenade from its container, releasing the lever. 4 seconds later, detonation. The Viet Cong used American M26 and M33 grenades captured during base overruns. Chinese-made Type 67s smuggled down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, even Soviet RGD-5s. More sophisticated versions use multiple grenades daisy-chained to a single tripwire, creating overlapping blast zones. Some were positioned at ankle height to catch the unwary, others at chest level to target those moving in a crouch. Intelligence reports documented cases where tripwires were stacked vertically. One obvious wire at knee height that soldiers would carefully step over, and a second, hidden wire at ankle level that would trigger when they moved forward. But the most terrifying traps weren't grenades at all. The Bouncing Betty, officially the American M16 mine, but extensively captured and reused by Viet Cong forces, operated on a mechanism that exploited human biology. When triggered by pressure or tripwire, a small charge would propel the main body of the mine 3 to 4 feet into the air before detonation. The physics were precise. That height positioned the explosive at waist or chest level for maximum shrapnel spread. The mine contained 540 steel balls, each one 1/8 of an inch in diameter. Packed around a pound of TNT, when it detonated, those balls would spread in a circular pattern 30 meters across. Anyone within 10 meters faced near certain death. Anyone within 20 meters would be shredded by multiple impacts. Survivors described hearing the distinctive double detonation. First the small lifting charge, then a half-second pause before the main explosion, knowing in that frozen moment that death was incoming, but being unable to move fast enough to escape. By late 1966, every major American unit deployed explosive ordnance disposal teams, specifically trained in booby trap recognition and neutralization. Technical Sergeant James Morrison from the 25th Infantry Division's EOD unit developed detection protocols. Became standard throughout Vietnam. Probe every suspicious object with a thin rod. Never pull directly on visible wires. Mark cleared areas with engineer tape. And never under any circumstances assume a path is safe because previous patrols used it. Morrison's team successfully cleared 147 booby traps during a 6-month deployment in the Iron Triangle. But the mathematics were unforgiving. For every trap found and neutralized, intelligence estimated 3 remained undetected. Casualty rates from booby traps and mines continued climbing throughout 1966 and 1967, reaching 17% of all wounds and 11% of all American combat deaths by 1969. The Viet Cong's most devastating innovation came in late 1966, using captured American ordnance for booby traps. A standard 105mm howitzer shell, rigged with a tripwire detonator, delivered enough explosive force to kill everyone within 15 meters, wound soldiers 50 meters away. 8-inch artillery rounds, stolen during base attacks or scavenged from dud shells, could destroy vehicles and wipe out entire squads. Captain Robert Vance, intelligence officer with the 1st Infantry Division, walked through a recently captured Viet Cong staging area near Phuoc Vinh. His men had swept the area for traps, finding 7 punji pits and 3 tripwire grenades along the main trail. But something bothered Vance. Near each trap, he noticed peculiar details. A twig snapped at chest height, its breakpoint positioned precisely horizontal. 3 small rocks arranged in a triangular pattern 10 meters before a buried mine. A strip of bark peeled from a tree trunk, the white wood visible only from one approach angle. The Vietnamese interpreter with his unit dismissed them as random. Vance didn't think so. He photographed each marker, noting positions relative to the traps. Back, at base, comparing images from different sites, he saw it, a pattern. The Viet Cong were marking their own booby traps. The discovery changed American understanding of Viet Cong operational sophistication. The VC had developed an intricate system of natural markers, signals that warned friendly forces while appearing as random environmental details to American eyes. Broken branches weren't arbitrary. The angle of the break, the height, the direction the broken end pointed, all conveyed information. A branch snapped upward meant trap ahead on left side of trail. Snapped downward meant right side. Position stones functioned as distance markers. 3 rocks in a line meant trap within 10 meters. Arranged in a triangle meant trap immediate, next step. Bark blazes on trees indicated trap types through size and pattern. A hand-width strip meant punji pit. A narrow vertical cut meant tripwire grenade. The system exploited an asymmetry Americans couldn't easily overcome. VC forces grew up reading jungle environments as naturally as Americans read street signs. Distinguishing between a branch broken by weather and one broken as a deliberate signal required cultural knowledge that most American soldiers simply didn't have. Intelligence sections began putting together marker dictionaries, illustrated guides to Viet Cong warning systems. Reconnaissance units trained specifically in identification techniques. By early 1967, some American platoons could recognize basic markers, using them to navigate through trapped areas without casualties. A Marine company operating in Quảng Nam province identified 17 trap locations over 3 days, following VC marker patterns, avoiding every trap without needing engineers. The tactical advantage was significant. Patrols could move faster, casualties dropped, entire booby trap fields could be mapped and destroyed. But the Viet Cong weren't static opponents. As American forces learned to read markers, the VC changed them. Codes that worked in November meant nothing by January. Regional variations added complexity. Markers used by VC units in the Mekong Delta differed from those in the Central Highlands. Some markers indicated not trap locations, but safe paths. A reversal that caught American forces expecting the opposite. The organizational discipline required to implement and update these systems across hundreds of independent units was extraordinary. It required centralized training, regular communication, systematic instruction of new recruits. American intelligence officers, trained to respect conventional military structures, found themselves grudgingly admiring an enemy that could coordinate such sophisticated systems while appearing to operate as scattered guerrilla bands. The intelligence battle became a continuous cycle of adaptation. Americans would decode a marker system, use it successfully for weeks, then suddenly suffer casualties when the markers changed. Each decoded system represented months of observation and analysis, only to become obsolete overnight. And by mid-1967, Viet Cong units began something more devious, placing false markers deliberately designed to mislead American forces. Markers that appeared to warn of traps on the left would come before traps on the right. Distance markers would be positioned too close or too far, encouraging careless movement. The tactic transformed even decoded markers from advantages into potential death sentences, forcing American units to question every signal they thought they understood. The most dangerous traps weren't always in the jungle, they were beneath it. By early 1967, American forces had discovered the full extent of the Cu Chi tunnel system, over 150 miles of underground passages. Had taken the Viet Cong 2 decades to build. Someone had to go down there. Specialist Harold Roper was among the first to volunteer. At 5 feet 6 inches and 127 pounds, he fit the profile. Small enough to navigate passages designed for Vietnamese fighters. Brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to crawl into absolute darkness. Armed only with a .45 caliber pistol and a flashlight. The entrance Roper faced measured 24 inches wide. No radio would work underground. No backup could reach him in those narrow passages. He took one last breath of open air, then lowered himself into the earth. The walls pressed against his shoulders immediately. The ceiling scraped his back. 20 feet in, the tunnel split into 3 directions. Intelligence had warned about false passages, dead ends rigged with explosives designed to kill anyone who reached them. Roper chose the center passage, crawling forward on his belly, flashlight clenched in his teeth. The Viet Cong had spent years perfecting underground warfare. The tunnel complexes operated on 3 levels, some reaching depths of 30 feet. They included living quarters, hospitals, supply caches, weapons factories, command centers. But they also functioned as elaborate death mazes for any American foolish enough to enter. Trap doors opened onto punji pits. False floors collapsed into flooded chambers. Some passages narrowed progressively until they became impassable, forcing intruders to crawl backward. Where pressure plates waited, the VC deliberately placed venomous snakes, bamboo vipers and crates, in small boxes positioned at head height in dark passages. Opening the box or brushing against a tripwire would release them directly onto a tunnel rat's face and neck. Scorpion boxes serve similar purposes. Some tunnel sections could be flooded from above, drowning anyone inside. Others were rigged with explosives on delayed fuses, giving VC defenders time to escape before detonation. Some tunnel rats survived through skill and luck. Sergeant Robert Baer spent 6 months exploring Cu Chi tunnels, developing techniques that kept him alive. Listen before moving, probe every surface before applying weight, mark your path obsessively, trust nothing. His team successfully mapped portions of the complex, captured supply caches, survived several firefights with VC defenders in absolute darkness. Encounters where muzzle flash was the only light, and the sound of gunfire in enclosed spaces could rupture eardrums. They brought back intelligence that helped locate tunnel entrances and plan destruction operations, but the psychological cost was absolute. Every tunnel rat who survived developed symptoms later recognized as severe PTSD. Claustrophobia, hypervigilance, night terrors, inability to function in enclosed spaces. The casualty rate, both physical and psychological, approached 100%. Men who went underground repeatedly aged visibly within months. Some refused to continue after a single mission. Others kept volunteering, driven by something between duty and fatalism, until they didn't come back. Specialist James Lindsay disappeared into a tunnel near Ben Cat in March 1967. Search teams found the entrance collapsed, the passages beyond too unstable to risk recovery operations. His body was never recovered. The Viet Cong responded to tunnel rat operations by enhancing their defenses. New sections included more sophisticated traps, tighter passages, more frequent false routes. They began rigging entire tunnel sections for collapse, willing to sacrifice portions of their network to kill American intruders. By late 1967, tunnel rat missions were evolving into near-suicidal reconnaissance operations. The volunteers who still went down knew the odds, understood the enemy was always one innovation ahead, but descended anyway, because someone had to. And because the alternative was allowing the Viet Cong to operate with impunity beneath American feet. The helicopters arrived in waves throughout the night, rotors beating against monsoon rain, landing lights cutting through darkness at the 12th Evacuation Hospital near Cu Chi. Stretchers rushed through triage, carrying the wounded from a company-sized patrol that had triggered multiple traps in a suspected VC staging area. The surgeons worked under harsh fluorescent lights, their hands moving with practiced efficiency through trauma procedures that had become routine. Private Michael Chen had stepped on a punji stake that drove through his boot and into his foot. The stake coated with feces, already showing signs of infection despite the medic's immediate treatment. Specialist David Martinez had caught shrapnel from a tripwire grenade, metal fragments embedded throughout his lower legs and abdomen. Corporal James Wilson had the worst injuries, A bouncing Betty had detonated within 5 meters, the 540 steel balls shredding both legs below the knee. The surgeon examining Wilson's wounds knew immediately. Both legs would require amputation above the knee. He was 21 years old. The statistics told a story that American commanders struggled to communicate to Washington. Between January 1965 and June 1970, booby traps and mines caused 11% of all Army deaths, 17% of all wounds. Numbers that seem modest until translated into human cost. That 11% represented thousands of American soldiers killed by weapons that cost almost nothing to produce. The 17% represented tens of thousands wounded, many suffering injuries more devastating than conventional combat wounds. A bullet or shrapnel from a firefight typically created clean entry and exit wounds that surgeons could treat. Punji stakes drove filth-contaminated bamboo deep into tissue, creating infections that required weeks of antibiotic treatment, often resulted in amputation anyway. Mine blasts caused traumatic amputations that left survivors requiring decades of prosthetic care and rehabilitation. The medical consequences extended far beyond immediate casualties. Infections from contaminated stakes created complications lasting months. Amputation rates from booby trap wounds exceeded those from gunshot wounds. And the psychological trauma proved even more resistant to treatment than physical injuries. By 1969, field hospitals had developed innovations that dramatically improved survival rates. Medevac helicopters could transport wounded soldiers from battlefield to surgical theater within minutes. The golden hour that made Vietnam's casualty survival rate the highest in American military history. Surgeons perfected techniques for treating traumatic amputations, saving limbs that would have been lost in previous wars. New antibiotics could control infections from contaminated wounds. Evacuation procedures evolved to prioritize booby trap casualties, recognizing that minutes mattered with sepsis developing from filth-coated stakes. If a wounded soldier reached medical attention alive, he had better than a 95% chance of survival. But survival wasn't recovery. The soldiers who lived carried wounds that medicine couldn't heal. They developed permanent hypervigilance, an inability to trust any ground surface, any doorway, any apparently safe structure. They couldn't walk through tall grass without scanning for tripwires. They couldn't enter buildings without checking thresholds for pressure plates. Their nervous systems had been rewired by trauma into permanent alert states, states that would persist for decades after the war ended. Psychiatrists later documented how booby trap survivors exhibited symptoms distinct from combat trauma, a specific form of PTSD characterized by environmental hypervigilance rather than combat flashbacks. The ground itself had become the enemy, and that enemy couldn't be defeated or escaped. It was everywhere, invisible, waiting. And the casualties kept mounting. In 1967, mines and booby traps caused 4,300 American casualties. In 1968, that number climbed to 5,800. By 1969, division commanders reported that approximately half of all hostile casualties resulted from mines and booby traps. The chief of the U.S. Mine Warfare Center acknowledged that official statistics were probably conservative. Many casualties classified as fragmentation wounds likely resulted from mine detonations that couldn't be confirmed. The war continued. Patrols still moved through suspected VC territory, and every step remained a calculated risk against an enemy that didn't wear a uniform or carry a rifle, but waited in the earth beneath American boots. The wars some soldiers fight never end. Robert Martinez returned from Vietnam in 1970, physically intact but carrying wounds that wouldn't heal. 30 years later, he stood at the edge of a suburban park in Ohio, watching his 12-year-old son run ahead down a path bordered by tall grass. The boy called back, asking his father to follow. Martinez couldn't move. His hands had started shaking, sweat beading on his forehead despite the mild weather. His son ran back, confused. "It's just grass, Dad." Martinez knew it was just grass. He also knew that knowledge changed nothing. In 1968, grass that looked just like this had concealed a tripwire connected to 3 daisy-chain grenades. The man walking point that day, a private whose name Martinez could still recite, had died before the medic reached him. Martinez's nervous system had recorded that lesson permanently. 45 years after leaving Vietnam, His brain couldn't distinguish between a suburban park in peacetime Ohio and a contested trail in Quảng Nam province. Medical researchers studying Vietnam veterans discovered that booby-trap survivors exhibited a distinct form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Unlike combat PTSD, which typically showed up as flashbacks to firefights and hyperarousal to sudden noises, booby-trap PTSD created environmental hypervigilance. Veterans couldn't trust any ground surface. They approached doorways with caution decades after anyone last rigged one with explosives. They'd pause before stepping over fallen logs on hiking trails, scanning for tripwires that didn't exist. The constant fear of traps had rewired their neural pathways, survival mechanisms that had kept them alive in Vietnam but couldn't be switched off in civilian life. A 2013 study tracking Vietnam veterans more than 40 years after service found that 11% of male combat veterans still met criteria for PTSD. Those exposed to highest levels of combat trauma, showing double the risk of heart disease, chronic pain conditions, psychological disorders. Compared to non-combat veterans, the physiological effects extended beyond mental health. The constant stress response triggered by environmental hypervigilance correlated with cardiovascular disease, hypertension, shortened life expectancy. Some veterans found pathways to healing. Support groups specifically for booby-trap survivors allowed men to discuss fears they couldn't articulate to families who'd never walked a contested trail. Cognitive behavioral therapy helped reprogram responses to environmental triggers. In the 1990s, some veterans organized return trips to Vietnam, visiting former battlefields, meeting former enemies, attempting to overlay peaceful present-day realities onto traumatic memories. These pilgrimages helped certain individuals, seeing Cu Chi tunnels as a tourist attraction rather than a death maze, walking trails where mines had been cleared, meeting Vietnamese civilians living normal lives in former combat zones. The exposure therapy worked for some, allowing them to separate past threats from present safety, but many carried the scars until death. They avoided hiking, camping, any activity requiring trust in unfamiliar ground. They insisted on ground floor apartments, refused basements, developed elaborate rituals for entering buildings. Their children grew up watching fathers check door frames before entering, observing behaviors that seemed inexplicable until family members learned about the war. The invisible wounds proved more persistent than amputations or scars. At least those injuries could be seen, acknowledged, treated within existing medical frameworks. Environmental hypervigilance existed in the gap between normal anxiety and diagnosable disorder. Severe enough to constrain lives but often insufficient to qualify for full disability compensation. And in Vietnam itself, the war's deadly legacy persisted. By 2020, unexploded ordnance remained buried throughout former combat zones. Mines, artillery shells, booby-trap components oxidizing slowly beneath jungle soil. Vietnamese farmers still triggered decades-old traps while plowing fields. Children found corroded grenades while playing. Between 1975 and 2020, unexploded ordnance killed approximately 42,000 Vietnamese civilians, injured another 62,000. The American war had ended in 1973, but the weapons remained active, still killing, still maiming. The final casualties of a conflict that transformed entire landscapes into permanent minefields, where every step carried the weight of history and the possibility of sudden death.